This is David Meyer O'Shea, son of Earl B. Meyer, Company H, 379th, 95th Infantry. Today is February 20th, 2008. We're in the neighborhood church, 415 Paseo del Mar, Palos Verdes Estate, California. Also in the room are videographer Leslie and Doug, and co-interviewer Steve Sheridan. This interview is for the Veterans History Project. It's sponsored in part by the Hollywood Post of the American Legion. And today I am talking to, sir, could you say your name?
My name is Bob Miller, Robert W. Miller.
Could you spell your last name?
M-I-L-L-E-R.
And where were you born, Mr. Miller?
Actually born in a place called Buhl, Minnesota.
And what's your birth date?
Robert W. I'm Robert.
You're Robert. Okay.
Yeah.
Robert, what's your birth date?
July 22nd, 1924, 84 years old.
84 years old. And what was your highest rank?
The first lieutenant.
First lieutenant. And what branch of service were you in?
Well, I went in when it was the Army Air Corps, but I spent my career in the new U.S. Air Force that was founded in 42 with Hap Arnold.
Yes, and when did you start your service? When did you?
Well, I came out of a freshman out of Harvard in late 41, and that's one of the things I would like to talk about a little bit. But
and when did you finally leave the service?
46, end of 46.
End of 46. Okay. Now, just a few questions. What were your parents' names?
My father's name was Helmick Ross Miller.
And what's your mother's name?
Ida Jane Smith. Her maiden name.
Maiden name. And did you have any siblings?
Do what?
Any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I had two brothers.
What were their names?
One was Ross Miller Jr. and one was Curtis Miller.
Okay.
They were older than me.
And did you live in Buhl growing up?
No. I was just born there. That's where the hospital was, as it happened. And we moved to Duluth, and then really spent most of my early life in Minneapolis.
In Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any Minneapolis questions you'd like to ask?
No. I'm sure Bob's got
great stories. Okay, good. What was your family like growing up?
Well, the real part of my family life is my father died early. He was a professor of chemistry. And so he died when I was 15. So at that time, my mother took a job on the University of Minnesota campus as head of the women's dormitory. And my two older brothers had gone into journalism out of the University of Minnesota. And so I lived with her there and was allowed to go, because of my father's history, into the rather prestigious University of Minnesota High School, which had a great deal to do with the story you're going to hear today, because it was a school where, for example, I majored in physics and mathematics, and even studied calculus there, which you don't generally get at the high school level. And so I graduated at the top of the class of 41 at the University of Minnesota High School and got a national scholarship to Harvard. Now, is this the kind of story that you want to hear, the sequence?
Sure. So,
all right. So I went down to Harvard and as on a national scholarship that James Bryant Conant, if you remember that name, president of Harvard, wanted to bring in out of the Midwest, out of the corn states, two promising people every year to mix it up with all those prep school guys back at Harvard. And I was one of them in 1941, okay? When I got to Harvard, I decided to take the most advanced courses I could get away with, and that was very much to do with what we're going to come to. I went into Physics B rather than Physics A because I was going to be a physics major. And I also I skipped differential calculus and went right into integral calculus, which was a little foolhardy of me, but that's what I did, because and as you may know, integral calculus is much more difficult conceptually in many ways than straight differential calculus. And at Harvard, it's particularly difficult. But it saved my life, or that had a lot to do with what happened to me, because about this same time, General Hap Arnold, down in Washington, or where yeah, that's where he would have been, had decided that the U.S. Air Force that he now commanded was going to expand tremendously in major volume of missions and a number of stations and so forth, and was woefully short of meteorologists, woefully. I think the number that was bandied about, I never did hear it exactly, was somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 meteorologists needed to be trained, and quickly, but certainly a number close to 5,000 to the best of my knowledge. So a crash program was put into effect, and I'll tell you about its structure and so forth. It was quite amazing to train meteorologists, and I decided to go that way. Now, one of the key criterion was that you had to have at least a B in integral calculus to get into this program, because they wanted to go into hydrodynamic equations and so forth. So at the end, near the end of my freshman year, I had the three choices: ASTP, the Armor Service Training Program, or the Navy. I didn't qualify for the Navy because I've always worn glasses. I thought about ASTP, and then I thought about this new program, which wasn't too clear, and made a fateful decision to go with it. Fateful because if I can kind of back around here a little bit, most of my classmates stayed in the ASTP, where you were allowed to stay in college as long as you had B-level grades, and when you finished, you had to become commissioned, and most of them took that route. Unfortunately for them, in about late 45, 46, I'll come back to myself, but most of them were suddenly caught up in the Battle of the Bulge crisis.
My father.
And they were shipped out of Harvard Square one night and spent 3 weeks maximum in Fort Dix, put on ships and sent over to the Battle of the Bulge, where most of them either died from exposure or enemy action, you know, with that level of training. 20% of the class of 46 of Harvard died in World War II.
44.
The majority of them at the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, they would have been the class of 46. They pulled them out in 44.
Right.
And they started pulling them out. I know the people I've talked to from University of Pennsylvania, they pulled them out in March and April, and sent them to joined my father with the 95th Infantry at Indiantown Gap. These guys have been together for a year and a half.
Yeah.
And these kids from ASTP had 10 weeks of training, and they all got sent to France.
I was there. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened, but I knew many of them, so forth. Sure. I didn't go that way. I chose the meteorology program. It sounded a little challenging, and I had a B minus in integral calculus, and I was in.
Yes.
That changed my whole life and military career, if you want to be really frank about it. First thing that happened to me after a boot camp, you know, at Kearns Field, Utah, I went in through the fort at Minneapolis. But after 3 weeks of that, we were sent first to quite a sophisticated program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. A 4-month program trained in extensions of upper mathematics, and including tensor analysis, which is something I would never thought I would get into and use, but that's a very remote form of extended integral calculus. The purpose being to acquaint you with equations of hydrodynamic flow and so forth in the atmosphere. A little bit theoretical. The professors who designed this for General Arnold were a little bit theoretical, but that's what happened. And it was hard duty in its own way intellectually, but we had wonderful quarters on the University of Wisconsin at Madison on the lake shore, and marched off to school, and a heavy drill of that for 3 months. Then we were sent off to the meteorology training program, Institute of Meteorology at the University of Chicago for 6 months. Now that, again, was easy living. We all stayed in Rockefeller Center in a fine place. We had we were cadets. We were cadets at this point. And I can maybe tell you a story or two there, but we had a very rigorous set of courses in both the theory of the atmosphere and all of the equations that go with that, plus standard synoptic meteorology training. But we again marched off to school every day and had long labs. We spent mostly 12-hour days in school for 6 months doing, so it was intellectually challenging, but it certainly wasn't military duty. I can tell you one quick story. We did have to do such things as stand guard at night just for practice outside the Rockefeller Center with a rifle in our hand, which we didn't know how to use. But anyway. And one night I was pulled guard duty out there, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was standing out there just trying to get through the evening and night, and heard a volley of gunfire, machine gun must have been shots, and not far away. And then a squad car pulled up, and the cop says, "Soldier, you hear any shots here?" And I said, "Yes." And so I explained to him when and where I heard from him. Well, the next morning in the papers, it turned out that one of Al Capone's lieutenants lived just down the block from there, and he had been ambushed with men behind the hedge and had 19 bullets in his spine. And so that was just that was the closest at that point in my life I got to gunfire. Anyway, I graduated at the top of, with one of 6 at the top of that class and at the University of Chicago meteorology course. And the top 6 of us were then designated not to go on into line meteorology, but to be sent back to Harvard and MIT for radar training, because it had just been determined that radars, the big old ground radars don't detect rain, but they'd been able to get the wavelength down to 10 centimeters, and I'll explain in just a minute 3 centimeters, which was critical. And it became clear that radars properly deployed could detect weather and could be used for weather reconnaissance and operational purposes. So what I really did was go back to Harvard and spent a few 4 months in a special little private course on electromagnetic theory and everything about that end of the spectrum. And then I was into a 4-month program, which really was the challenging thing, at the so-called radiation laboratory of MIT. That was a euphemism for classified radar work, training in the use of it, understanding the equipment and so forth, and led by some prestigious professors, Julia Stratton, people like that, MIT. What was critical from the fact that out of this, by the way, just to jump ahead, I became commissioned or ranked or classified as a weather radar research officer, okay? And what was critical, maybe worth possibly telling, is the 3 centimeter radar that made airborne radar possible.
Okay, yeah, talk about that.
Yes. Up to then, the big radars could only generate wavelengths this way, and then there was one that came along that could generate 10 centimeters. And that was being used for most of the aircraft surveillance and detection by the British and so forth, and of aircraft. Mm-hmm. Rain was a different subject. The equations and so forth had been worked out in the theory of this, had shown that 3 centimeters would a wavelength, if it could be achieved, would be an optimum wavelength for against so-called Rayleigh backscattering that was involved in detection by radar of rain. And the British had just evolved then a highly classified first magnetron. They had, which is a totally different unit, it's just like the magnetrons you know today, but the total generation was in a highly accurately machined cylinder like this with separate semicircular openings around it, and when that's activated under a high varying magnetic field, it generated 3 centimeter length waves for the first time. And that first model was brought over from England while I was there, and incorporated in a breadboard radar, which could be ultimately deployable on an aircraft. Very special time. And we worked with that for a while. By the way, the only reason, but this was just highly machined by machinists over in one of the great Jaguar factories in England. You couldn't go into volume on this. But one day in the lab, Percy Spencer, a famous scientist, a Harvard scientist, but he was associated with Raytheon, and he was leaning against this breadboard, and it started to heat up his shoulder and so forth. And that's how, I mean, it was known to be dangerous and warming, but he got there for a few minutes. And that's why he got interested in, well, how are we going to mass produce this thing in the long run? Now, actually, that side of it happened a little later, but he, being a wonderful Yankee, inventive type, found a completely different way to get the high accuracy by taking copper plates, stamping them, and then under controlled heating, highly controlled heating, making surfaces which were perfectly accurate, millimeter accuracy, and a 3 centimeter magnetron was on its way into existence. And of course, that's the magnetron that uses in all of our appliances today. But that's how all that happened. That's how Percy Spencer became a vice president of Raytheon and so forth. And that's how we got the equipment to work with. Now, it took a little time for all that to happen, but I finished that and did very well in that. And there weren't any actual production versions of this 3 centimeter type airborne equipment yet ready. So I was detailed for just very quickly down to a different project as a weather radar research officer down at the Signal Corps station in New Jersey, Fort Monmouth. And there they had finished, starting in production, one of the first gun-laying radar vans. It was a 10 S-band device. But its purpose in life was, of course, to track artillery shells for close tracking. And it had begun to be produced and so forth in quantity and being deployed to the field just for that purpose. One was, however, made available to us as part of the Air Force Weather Radar Research Team with a general idea of, couldn't we use this gun-laying radar to track launched balloons more accurately? And then you can get through theodolite tracking and thus get wind tracking to higher altitudes and so forth. Well, the concept was fine. The damn equipment was tough to handle, the slewing on it and so forth. But indeed, we launched there were 3 of us on that project. We launched, we put the equipment way out on the shore over near the Atlantic, and used it particularly in bad weather when regular meteorological balloons were lost in 2 minutes into the cloud. And we put a big reflector on there, just the right size for 10 meter, kind of an experimental reflector. And we had design, and we worked for about only a couple of months with that, and lo and behold, like you would expect, we were able to track the balloon and get with velocity and angle measurements that allowed us to calculate wind speed way on up to 10,000 feet through the most serious weather. It was an obvious solution, and it worked. And it really became quite important because then that allowed other people to do that too. With wind speed, with good wind speed data, that is vector data, yes, velocity and direction, you can plot that and then locate what's called 10,000 foot lows, which steer most weather systems. Okay, very, very critical to be able to do that, and it became important on the D-Day invasion, all of those things. So we showed that would work. the problem became how to implement it, and a balloon, a thing called a drop sonde, which would hang under a balloon, or even dropped off an airplane as soon as it came into being, but it was put into crash production. And the first ones were pretty straightforward, and then they added pressure measurement gear on it. But the point is, for a while I was sent off right after that to help expedite that equipment out of the production line of a company in Pawtucket, because it was that critical. I mean, Washington wanted head counts on where things stood in the middle of the line and so forth. So I got a little exposure to industrial production, which I, of course, had never had at that point. Up to that point in my life as a 19-year-old, I guess that's what I was about that time. And then when we got that line straightened out, then I went off to one other project before the big project that I want to finish with here today. One of the first production 3-centimeter radars, called the APQ-13, was made available to be put up on a stationary tower, turned around, and to detect thunderstorms. And the experiment, or the deployment, was to be at a big new B-29 base down in Palos, Texas. Reason the B-29 training was the B-29s were just coming off of production from Wichita in fairly large quantities, and so a heavy training program was needed. And they chose Palos, Texas, way out in the outside of Big Spring, because it was just flat for miles, and they could put in about the longest runway you've ever seen in the world for training purposes. That's where the B-29 guys all more or less trained before they went off to Japan. Now, problem was that in the summertime around that part of the world, it heats up the desert uniquely and does spot thunderstorms, which can be quite violent, and at least if you get into them. And so they thought, well, let's find out where those are starting up and how we can detect them. So I went down there, and we put up, another sergeant and I put up a turned around APQ-13, and on the tower, got it going, and indeed it was excellent in detecting out for about 80 miles out, 100 miles out, incipient thunderstorms, and spotting them and telling the commander tell the guys to stay away from that area on today's routine. Sure. So that was what we did in that particular experiment. I did learn a lot about life down there, because a bunch of B-29 pilots who've gone through all the training, the kind you heard here today from the other, all that heavy training, and then about to deploy to Japan, are some pretty rough guys. And there were pretty rough and wild parties at that place, let me tell you. But I was just a young officer doing weather radar research over there, but I can tell you, though, on Saturday night, the colonel that ran the club had to keep the guys in line with enlisted men with machine guns, keeping them away from the girls that were brought in from the Big Springs telephone company to be dance partners. He literally did. They were drunk as a hoot all, and so it was kind of an interesting. That was part of it. I was learning things there.
Sure. How many theoretical physicists were down there with you?
Just me.
Just you? Oh my
well, I wasn't a theoretical physicist yet. I'd only had a year of physics at Harvard. That's a long way from being a theoretical physicist. But I was doing a lot of hands-on work that it's just what I'm describing is what it is.
Sure.
So we got that going, and that was fine. And then I was selected to go to a project that was just being formed at mighty Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the big research and development base of the Air Force, called AUMET 8. And there was a division, a new division for using all the modern technology that was available at the time to get all-weather flying going for all purposes, for landing, for So there was an all-weather flying division, and a subset program, project number 8 on that, was to use the new 3-centimeter or X-band airborne radar for weather radar reconnaissance, detection and reconnaissance, and that was my project. So there I was at Wright-Patterson I was a second lieutenant when I got there. I came out of all of what I'm going to tell you now, a year experience and my end of my career in the military as a first lieutenant, because guys with my classification are a little unusual. They didn't know quite to do with us, but that's how Washington wanted. They wanted this project, and they wanted some of this kind of work done. So I had a B-25 assigned to me, and MIT was put under contract to support us with specialized equipment, which I'll describe in just a minute. And one P-61 that already had a 10-centimeter radar, and with us, we were going to compare signals and so forth and go through thunderstorms, which we did. But our objective was to determine exactly how to use the X-band radar in circumnavigating major frontal systems. And also to do some corollary work on what it is that the radar really was detecting. We knew it had to do something with drop size, but we wanted to know more about that. And what were the conditions that prevailed in certain places in the echo. You guys know what an echo is on a radar scope. And how could you change the radar in terms of what's called pulse repetition frequency to optimize and get the maximum detection range, so that the reconnaissance planes taking 17s across to Europe could see it far ahead into front lines and so forth. So that was the objective of all of this. So we got the program going, and MIT helped out on some fancy equipment called a disdrometer, which we mounted in the front of the B-25, which actually could calculate number of raindrops pelleting and their approximate size. We put some pretty sensitive equipment in there. All of this took a lot of time, and we put, of course, the radar itself, we adjusted that, and we also put in ancillary equipment like one that recorded pressure and temperature and all of that kind of thing. And we began a program of approaching major frontal systems out of Wright-Patterson across the Midwest whenever one came up.
Now, was this unique in the world? Were there other programs other than the British and the American programs? Was this technology that was...
That's what I'm going to be proud to tell you. This was the first time anybody was doing this particular work with an X-band radar.
Good Lord.
Oh, yes. This was... I explained how it had come on rather fast, so this was the first of its kind. No, the British didn't have production models of X-band radar to the best of my knowledge. Only we did, because of what I mentioned about Percy Spencer's work and things like that. So we had the wherewithal to do this. We instrumented that baby, and one of my little stories is that that took a lot of time and a lot of technicians working, and one of the generals used to come down and say, "Miller, when are you going to get that B-25 off the ground?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "We're still instrumenting it." And he said, "What kind of instruments you putting in?" And I said, "Well, one of them is a disdrometer." And he says, "Well, what's that?" And I says, "Well, it's to collect raindrop size and sample." And he says, "My God," he says. And I said, "Well, sir, I think, it'll be done within another month." It took some time to instrument this particular aircraft.
And about what time? Is this 1945? Or
yeah, right about there.
Okay.
Mid-45-ish.
Okay.
Was there a tight security lid on this whole program?
No, there's a high security rests with the radar equipment, but there was no high security in the sense of at least nobody ever told me there was, and I published a paper, but about what the range we could see. It was more in the academic, scientific kind of a thing, really. What could it do that was going to be any good operationally? But the secretly and the equipment, that was classified. Yeah, oh yes, that's true. So I had a pilot assigned to me who had been shot down in Germany and been reassigned. He thought he was going to get easy duty and had a few problems there and then a flight crew and so forth. And we then watched the weather systems in the summer when they're most active come through the Midwest, and went up and made a number of flights over 20 or 30 through back and forth through the systems, using the radar, using all this equipment, and tracing the meteorological constants. We did what we called a run. I handled the radar scope and adjusted the receiver gain for reasons I'll explain in just a minute. Then the sergeant ran the other equipment, and then we had a standard flight crew up front. And we would stand off and look at the frontal system and make certain adjustments about the radar to see the intensity. By adjusting the sensitivity of the radar gain, we could see the core of the storm and then changing it to larger. It was a kind of a crude approach compared to the Doppler radar you see on television today, but it was the only thing we had at the time. We didn't have the Doppler circuitry that in all present-day radars.
But it was the first of its kind.
Yes. So we were the work was the first of its kind. So we then went through all and measured, and we found out a lot of things, and had some pretty exciting times. I'll come to that in a minute. But we found out that if you approach an echo, first of all, we found we could get the range up to about 90 miles with changing parameters of the radar equipment itself. That was important. The more notice you have, the more time you have to navigate around it. And that was important. Then on the meteorological side, we went through at various kinds of intensities. We found that, I'll come to a finding now. We found when a cell had been there for quite a while and it stabilized and didn't have sharp edges, it was relatively safe to fly through. And generally, the lightning action was not strong there and so forth. But what we theorized about, and which was where there is a shear, that is, where the contour change of raindrop intensity changes rapidly from heavy to light. That's the shear area. That which we could detect by changing the radar gain slightly, and determining what part of the frontal line was in shear condition and what was more stable. Yes. So then I finally got the pilot to take me through a few shear lines. And we, at various altitudes, as much as we could get out of the B-25, I think was maybe 20,000, 22,000. But that, without going through the details, that was the run, which doesn't get close to our but I can assure you it was quite an experience, because we hit 4 Gs. And as we went through, which is a very dramatic shear.
But because as they say, God is in the details. I'd love to hear just a description of one of the shear runs.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll tell you.
Okay, good.
As you approach this thing, I said to the pilot, we're going to go through this way today. We're not going through the safe thing. We're going to go through the shear area, and I think I've got it lined up on the radar through my work on the scope there. Changing the what's called the gain. I was plotting the area. So we're going to go through that one today. And we went through, and then we went up to decided to go. I wanted to go as high as possible into the cumulonimbus. This particular system had not formed a nimbus yet. That is the ice cloud, the ice crystal cloud. It was still just about there, and it was just beginning to be very active. But so we went through that area. and hit a strong vertical line, a shear line, so bad I was strapped down. I was okay. The sergeant actually, when we came out the other side and we got the other side of the shear line, had a negative 3G. He actually went up to the ceiling of the B-25 and tore his flight suit open. It was rough, but and the plane heaved around violently and so forth. And then we had a marvelous example of St. Elmo's fire. The whole plane was lit up by St. Elmo's. As you may know, St. Elmo's is not lightning per se, but when you're in an electrostatic field, a severe one, and boy, we were there. It ionizes the air and turns it into blue shimmer, and then it bleeds off on small surfaces, in this case the trailing edge of the wing. So the whole plane was bathed in big shimmering blue and yellow waves, enough to scare you. You know, the ancient mariners experienced this in heavy storms when they get into them and off the bowsprits, but a little bit. But this was much more continuous. The whole thing was just, the pilot was afraid some of that stuff was going to come inside, but I assured him it would stay outside, because that's he didn't understand that it wouldn't come inside. But so we got through it and took the measurements and sort of corroborated that the whole idea of this. We never did quite that level again, but we did corroborate that the shear line was the thing. And we finished up the program, and I wrote a paper on the whole subject, which was the first paper published. It appeared in the Journal of Meteorology, or the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, in January of 1947. And you can read it yourself if you want.
But perhaps I shall now, and this time you're what, 22, 23 years old?
Yeah, yeah.
And you're writing the article.
Yeah, and there I recommended, we had some arguments with Washington about this, that the pilots be encouraged, if they had to pass through a frontal line with no brakes, use a cell had been open for more than 20 minutes, and where the gradation on the cell was even, that would probably be the best place. Stay away from the shear line areas on the thing by a factor of at least 2 miles. And if you have to go through a major line, find an area with at least a 4-mile break on scope return, and go through the middle of it. And so that was kind of our guidance. And that idea was used by the commercial aircraft industry after World War II, once they began to get X-band radar as a guiding principle. So
is that principle still the guiding principle?
Sure, it's a guiding principle, but you see, modern technology has overtaken all that. Today, everybody has ground and airborne Doppler radar, which detects these. To use this the way I had to in that room, and I had to do a lot of adjusting and a fair amount of calibration and so forth. Today, the Doppler radar clearly can differentiate between heavy rain, medium rain, and transition from there and you've seen that yourselves on your television. It's the green, the yellow, and red. The edges of the red are the most turbulent. The edges of the green are less turbulent. The yellow is less turbulent. Yes. And the edges of the green are probably going to be okay. So, the Doppler is a much more effective way to determine this kind of...
the edges of red are the shear zone.
Yeah, for the shear zones are. So, the red ones you certainly want to stay away from in any aircraft.
Unless you're...
My wife, I wanted to say that I did all this work, but meanwhile, I was a first lieutenant living in a big Air Force base, most very important one with hundreds of millions of dollars of procurement contract, all staffed by many generals, many full colonels, and so forth. So the place was filled with field grade, as they say, officers, majors, and up, and there wasn't any place for lieutenants. And most of them had homes, and they had the senior officers club. So they built a little junior officers club for research guys like me.
How many of them were you?
Whoa, there were only guys, the other guys were doing other kinds of work. I had this project, but there were only about 10 to 15 of us junior officers on the whole Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, whereas I assure you there must have been 200 full colonels. So we lived the life of Riley, and my wife wanted me to tell a little bit about this. And we had our own little club, but we weren't allowed to go to the senior officers club except on Saturday night parties. But we had our own little private chow line with our own little guy cook and so forth, and we even had maids making up our rooms. And I must have eaten an excellent. Every time I came in, the cook sergeant said, "Lieutenant, you're going to have one of your steaks tonight." And I must have eaten steak for 18 months, So that was my heavy. But that was the fine side of it, I suppose you might say. I did many reconnaissance missions over more of the United States, but I'm giving you the significant part of Met 8. The other thing was that we were allowed, that was where I learned that I would never play golf again. The junior officers couldn't go to the senior officers' golf course, so they developed a small golf course along the runway. No. Okay, and so one of the guys, I was too busy with my stuff, but some of the guys said, "Come on, Miller, let's come out and let's try to swing a golf club." So I went with them one day, and we went down there and practiced and shot and so forth. So I finally tried to take a great big drive, the best I could, and I did, and it was right along the runway, and just at that moment, a big B-29 was just landing about 20 feet out. It was coming in for all-weather division instrumentation, and I hooked or sliced, I don't know which one it is, but right into the cockpit window of that thing. And boy, was he mad. He got, and that was the end of golf for me. That happened to me in my living and this project. He stormed into operations, and where the hell's that guy? But I laid low, and the wind blew over on that thing, but it didn't do any damage. But he was very perturbed to have a golf ball hitting his thing, and more. But that is the reason I never have touched golf again, and my friends can't get me to wonder why that is, and that's the reason for that. So then. That really did finish with coming on of V-Day Day and so forth. VE Day. The project was finished. Nobody wanted me to go overseas or do anything else. At this point, they were rapidly limiting down on all these meteorologists. They were releasing meteorologists like mad. That was really the essence of the problem. They were being returned from Taiwan all over the world where they'd been. See how lucky I'd been. I'd been sitting here in the United States doing this easygoing life, and so that's what happened. There was a general the cutback, tremendous, and you could opt out. And I opted out in 46 and went back to Harvard and went back to school and the undergraduate school because I only left as a freshman. And but the dean said to me, "You have so many academic credits of science that we're going to give you your major in science, all right, but you're going to have to do 1 year of humanities, language and philosophy and stuff like that." And since I was always a great classical music lover, I had a wonderful year of having classical music lessons with the great Walter Piston, a great composer, and and taking German and philosophy and hard stuff like that, and graduated. And then to finish the story, from the exposure I'd had that I've tried to describe to you guys, I decided to go on to the Harvard Business School. And when I graduated, I graduated from the Harvard Business School, and from there later came out to TRW as director of their project management information systems. So that kind of ends the story there.
A wonderful story.
It's a different story. I can't top the Harry story, but
Well, you know, it's a whole different. But then Harry, I never talked about St. Elmo's fire in such a way that you can like,
You can always tell a fire department by the way they're doing this business.
Yes.
but like Harry and like all the other people I'm sure you've interviewed, there were such accidents of what happened to you, which way you went as the war came on, and you never quite knew. And there were just moments of fate in everybody's life in that war, where some battle you turned the right way, or I happened to I got a B in integral calculus and went into the meteorology program, and I went out of the top of the class at the University of Chicago and got into the radar side, and all of these things just happened.
acts of faith.
Yeah.
Were there any frightening moments in flight, in your flight career? Were there any dangerous moments as far as...
The one I just described was quite dangerous.
Really?
Yeah, that penetration through a cumulonimbus, congested, just going into nimbus stage, deliberately through a high contour shear line was a very dangerous thing.
Was that B-29?
B-25.
B-25.
Yeah.
Was that a more vulnerable craft than a super fortress, the B-25?
Well, I don't. First of all, we didn't have a 29 assigned for this. We just had a B-25, which was available. I think maybe because it's shorter range. But no B-29 was ever made available for this kind of work that I know of. Later, I'll just quickly say that the original work I did was supplemented by a major program to study the thunderstorm. It's using P-61s. It was a NASA program, but about 2 years later, with a lot of Air Force backup and so forth, P-61s instrumented with X-band radars, the kind APQ-13s and so on. And the difference, this was a much larger program. It actually was headed up by Horace Byers, one of my old professors. And they went through thunderstorms down in Florida and slicing through it simultaneously with half a dozen 61s at all the levels, and thus produced the definitive model of a classic thunderstorm cell, which is in the literature still today. Mine was a much more limited operation, trying to find out what we could do with the X-band radar, the first airborne X-band.
What was indicative of the harness being broken?
Well, yeah, my paper was used by the MIT staff and when I went back to Harvard, and in the summertime, MIT weather radar research staff took me on all summer long, and I got a little extra tuition money out of that in between years. Yeah. But then I left that, as I have mentioned, for the business world, and well, not really. TRW and the big aerospace programs were not conventional business, let me tell you out here.
Fascinating understood.
At one time, we had 30,000 people here working on all those classified some big satellite programs and so forth, and the ICBM programs. I was involved in the whole business of the management side, scheduling cost and control systems for the big satellites later in my civilian life. Okay, and it was a TRW when I finished my business career, retired in at my request, because of a tax law loophole. I could take out all the money without it being any taxes because of a 1930 loophole. So I retired in 1983, and I formed the first classical chamber orchestra at the Norris Theater, which I had got help built on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, the first professional classical orchestra that we've had in the South Bay. And that's been my activity ever since.
Oh, congratulations.
End of story.
End of story. And what instrument do you play?
Cello.
Cello.
Yeah.
Ah.
At Minnesota, the University of High School, I had studied cello with the principal cellist of the of the Minneapolis then Symphony. And I had another breakpoint. This is pre-military. I had a choice between going to the Curtis Institute of Music or taking the Harvard Scholarship. And I took the Harvard Scholarship. And it probably was the right move, because I never would have been that good a cellist. I mean, I could have been a good cellist in the sixth stand of the Philharmonic, but I never would have been, anyway, that was another fork in the road.
And when you made that choice, it must have been a difficult one.
It wasn't, because, well, it wasn't. I knew I wasn't going to be that good, and I would have gone down and studied. The Curtis Institute is free. I would have gotten a scholarship there. My teacher had studied with the great Emanuel Foreman there. But I also, my teacher encouraged my mother to have me go to Harvard instead, which was wise on his part, I think.
Well, gosh. The typical questions I close it with don't necessarily seem to apply, but I'll ask a few.
Sure,
anyway.
that's anything you want.
What do you think? Would you recommend military service to young people now?
I don't know. I've been too far away from it to be. Surely what I experienced was unusual. The World War II build-up, the Hap-Arnold meteorology program, the training that we were given while we were enlisted in cadets was incredible. I don't think that's matched anywhere today as such. If you're talking that point of view, sure. I think if you're a career professional in the military, West Point and all that, that's fine. That's certainly. But whether just to go in, period, or not, I just don't have the sense that they're incredibly intense programs that I tried to describe.
Yes, that's not in this army.
Yeah.
This military.
That was a function of the times.
It was a function of the times.
Yes.
That's interesting. I'm glad you brought that out. Well, when you look at your life so far and look back, what do you think's important? What have you found important?
Well, I think it's probably all important because it's my life.
Sure. Good question.
I don't have any I want to emphasize I feel very fortunate to have lucked out in making a couple of decisions which I could have no visibility of their critical importance. Integral calculus grade B allowed me to get into a meteorology program which I didn't know anything about.
B minus.
B minus. It was a good counter to the B though. Those kind of things are all fate, aren't they?
Yes. Now some people would talk about fate and they would see the hand of providence in it.
Oh yes.
Do you feel that?
Sure. We didn't have to survive that shear line run through there. I could have mentioned to you that when the pilot said, "Let's get out of here and go back and land fast," and we did. And we jumped out of the aircraft. We discharged through our flight boots. It was just like the most weird experience. We landed on the ground. We were still charged up. That much electrostatic had not disappeared, and we just discharged. A tremendous electrical shock went right through our feet. We were in pretty heavy-duty area.
Was there any visual evidence, or was it all just your nerves feeling that?
Did your feet crackle on the?
It felt like it felt like you probably feel like when you grab a bad wire, a high voltage wire, and you feel the burning sensation. It wasn't quite that bad, but it was pretty extreme for 10 seconds, draining all that electrostatic energy through your feet.
Oh.
Everybody went, whoa! We had a couple of drinks that night, I'll tell you.
Well, I don't know if we're going to top it ending like that.
I don't think that's topping Harry's story.
No,
I don't think so.
I mean, but for you, when
it's just a different story.
it's exactly.
Yeah.
No, they're all just different stories. And I'm glad that there's a record of them. Any other questions?
No, I'm just fascinated in what we've heard so far.
Well, that's all there is.
That's wonderful. Okay, I'll just close up. This has been actually a wonderful 56 minutes. I don't know if you feel like you've been talking that long, but at the end of 8 hours of interviews, I could listen for a long time.
Well, anyway, I think I covered a rather unusual or different thing that could happen to somebody in World War II. Yeah.
Never heard a story quite like it.
Never.
No, there aren't really that many weather radar research officers. I think there were only about 24 of us at the most for the whole United States Air Force. Well, there were 5,000 meteorologists, but people using these techniques.
Well, I have a question for you. I had talked to someone who had been the last aerial kill of World War II, and named Lee Kendall. I think he's passed now, and he flew a Douglas, what was it called, a night fighter? And he was talking about, this is an early interview, I knew very little, he was talking about it being an advanced plane because of the radar.
Right. The APS-10, there were two early airborne radars. The APS-10, which had a 10-centimeter length that we decided was no good for weather, and then the more advanced APQ-13, which had a 3-centimeter magnetron in it. But the night fighters had the 10-centimeter earlier production models. It's easier to generate 10-centimeter waves, as I've tried to indicate. And the machining of the Maggie is much easier and so forth. And those were used for tracking enemy fighters and so forth. Yeah, the radar was critical for that kind of an aircraft.
Well, thank you for telling me about that, because he's gone. He did say, he said there seemed to be a leak somewhere in intelligence, because whenever the night fighters went up, all the Japanese aircraft disappeared that day.
Well, right, because they could see with those APS-10s.
He says, and on the nights that they weren't up, that's when the Japanese aircraft.
Oh, yeah, no, the Japanese didn't have anything like that. No. Hey, an airborne radar, 10 or 3 centimeters, is a sophisticated piece of equipment, let me tell you. It really is. But of course, the radar expertness for the radar was all back at this MIT radiation laboratory. The designs of these things, that is by the MIT folks, and then taken over by the big production companies, Raytheon and so forth. But that's the equipment side was brilliantly engineered in this country. By civilians.
Do we have this? Do you feel like we have the same brilliance today as back then?
Sure. Okay. MIT and Harvard have brilliant students, of course.
That's true. Okay. Well, good. And on that note of faith, this is David Meyer O'Shea, son of Earl D. Meyer, Company H379th, and this has been. And I'm here with Steve Sheridan, Doug, and Mr. Miller. Will you say your name one more time?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Just to close.
Oh.
And do you remember your service number?
No, I don't.
Well, that's okay. You don't need to.
The mind is beginning to go at 84.
You've got a lot to remember.
Anyway, it is now 7:40 p.m. on February 20th, 2008.